Good evening. Today is November 14th, 2013. Haven't done a podcast in a while and I've got a little time, so I will do one. And tonight, rather than complain or criticize everything that's going on, I'll throw up 15 points that I think are necessary to get the United States back on track. This is based off of some Twitter comments I made earlier, and I just kind of briefly expanded them out. Not too much preparation, just because I want to get this stuff out quick. So here they are. Number one, and this actually will tie into point 15 later on. But if we want to get the U.S.A. working again, we really need to return to the Judeo-Christian ethic or worldview. Now, a lot of people might disagree with that, saying that that worldview is outdated, based on science, based on new forms of spirituality, a variety of reasons. And I'll just go value neutral on this for a second and say that's fine. You might have that opinion. It's just as valid for the sake of argument as other opinions. But the problem is our institutions were designed for people that were basically holding the Judeo-Christian worldview. And the more our people stray from that, and I think the polls show that people are in the midst of a sea change as far as they see religion and its role in our country, and if they're Christian or not. The numbers continue to plummet since the early 90s, which to me is very sad. So you might think that's a good thing. But ultimately, the institutions that we have were designed for people who had that worldview. A lot of people will say this was never a Christian country. I would absolutely agree. When we went out and slaughtered the Indians, that wasn't a very Christian thing to do. There's lots of things in our country's past that were not Christian. I would agree that this country was never a Christian country. In fact, I used to quote from the Founding Fathers saying that they were all Christians. A lot of them were, but the more I research, the more I've come around with people that I used to argue with. Most of our Founding Fathers were esoteric deists, Freemasons who have a different belief system. They use a lot of Christian terms, but it's not biblical Christianity. At the same time, Christianity had a huge impact on our society, and if you do a little cultural anthropology and go back, you can see that the average person in the United States, even though far from perfect, in the aggregate as pushing our nation to be a Christian nation, that the Bible and the Christian or Judeo-Christian worldview pretty much shaped a lot of the way we went about doing things. If that changes, our institutions that sit on top of that will have to change as well. And again, you might think that's a good thing. I don't. It's just a fact. We might have to become more totalitarian. We might have to become more socialist, less free, because the people that we have that make up our citizenry are no longer suited for those freedoms and the institutions we had previously, because they operate under a different set of values. So the easiest thing that I see, again, returning America to get it working as it was, is for our populace at large to return to the Judeo-Christian ethic, which will tie into point 15. Point number 2 is we need to bust up oligarchies, too big to fails, government-supported entities. I think that conservatives like myself kind of have this ideological blind spot where we look at capitalism as such a good thing that we're blind sometimes to its abuses. And one of the abuses is definitely crony capitalism and oligarchies, cabals getting together and doing things that go beyond what is traditionally defined as market economics. And now that many of these institutions, companies have grown up and sprouted wings and have gone transnational or extra-national, their interests don't often gel with American interests. We see that with the outsourcing the economy. They spend millions upon millions giving to schools that train our MBAs on how globalization is the cat's meow, old term. I don't know where that came from. How it's, the end-all, can't be stopped, is always good. But we see that their version of free trade is really more about worker exploitation around the world, about skirting regulations, about work week time, 18-hour days are what a lot of companies work for, and paying slave wages, and taking technology that was developed at great cost to the U.S. taxpayer. And I'm a little bit Elizabeth Warren on this. I think big companies do owe something back. There was unique attributes to the society that enabled these giant transnational corporations to develop here, and I do think they owe something back. I don't think it's fair that they just turn around and say, we don't need you anymore, when they were trained by American education, protected by American soldiers and police, drove on American roads and benefited from our infrastructure, and then they turn around and say, we get a better break elsewhere, see ya. I think it's their right to do that, but I think that, and this will come up in a further point, that they shouldn't be treated as American companies, and America should be about Americans first as far as our economy goes. Point number 3, balance the budget, which leads to a couple more points. But, just government spending is absolutely out of control, and it's going to be a tough sell to balance the budget, which leads to sub-points here. Number 4, decentralize power away from the federal government and give it less to do. Obviously, if the federal government has less to do, it can do its task better. It's just like having an employee. You give it 20 things to do, and it only does one of them well. Do you want to give it another 5 things to do? The federal government does do some things well, and there's some things that only governments can do, whether it be state, local, or federal. So I'm not an anarchist. I don't believe that zero government is a good thing. I kind of like having my food inspected. I like some form of referee that polices up individuals in a society and make sure everybody's sticking to the rules. And that's government, and I think that's a good thing, and I think it's when operating correctly is a blessing from God. But the federal government has become a monster, and it's grown out of control, and it's doing too many things. And now there's these huge wars that happen based on ideology. The government's so powerful and controls so much of our lives now that various ideological groups and special interest groups constantly go to war over the goodies that the federal government controls to try to steer them to their people. And the government uses those goodies as bribes and coercion tools to get companies to play along. As the government approaches over 20% of the GDP, if you're a corporation or a small business, more and more of your business is going to be with government, and the government's going to demand certain concessions from you, and you're just going to have to play ball. It's a form of soft tyranny, in my opinion. So we need to shrink the federal government, decentralize it, and give more power back to the states, kind of like our founding fathers envisioned. And it'll be good, I think, because there's so many hot button issues that are very polarized. To take those away from the federal government where it's winner take all and push them more towards states and communities, we can have a little bit more flexibility, and that might be a good thing for the country as we go down the road. Tariffs. A lot of economists talk about how tariffs are horrible. They caused the Depression, which I think Bernanke said that no, it was actually activity of the Federal Reserve that caused the Depression, and admitted it. Remember that this country initially operated on tariffs for its revenue. The federal government didn't have income tax and all these other taxes. Tariffs provided the income. It also provided protection for a young America to industrialize. And the people that want to bring down trade barriers, although in an altruistic, perfect world sense, it is more efficient, but in the real world sense, all these other countries operate in a mercantilistic means where they use trade as a means of national power. And I think the MBA types have really failed this country when they talk about how tariffs and economic protection is bad, because all other countries do this, and I've railed on this before. China does it, and there's different ways of doing it. You can have out-and-out laws that are in everybody's face saying, you can't compete in this industry, or if you do, you have to have a co-development partner. But there's more subtle ways of giving the home field an advantage, and even American companies do this a little bit, but not enough, because our economy has been hemorrhaging industrial capacity, and I'd say industrial capacity is the real part of our economy that generates wealth for all the other parts to play with. So we give up our industrial capacity. Not only is it bad for national security reasons, just saw an article about how China is putting in little hidden Wi-Fi devices in some of the consumer goods it exports back to countries like Russia and the United States that connect to home networks, hack them, and start sending your data out. And I'm sure that the Chinese would never do that to any of our military equipment, electronics that come from China. Cough, cough, that drone that went down in Iran, the stealth drone that just happened to land itself perfectly and was recoverable, I'd say that's probably an example of chipping, though I don't really have any evidence to support that. But tariffs were good because it would allow us to reindustrialize. If companies want to sell goods here, they've got to produce more of them here, and that provides jobs, which increases the tax base, which again goes back to point number 3, balancing the budget. Number 6, get rid of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is like a crack dealer, which enables the federal government to live way beyond its means. Right now, the Federal Reserve is monetizing the debt. I'm not an economist, but basically what they're doing, you can even go to the Federal Reserve Twitter accounts. I think the Twitter account from New York, you can find it, for the Federal Reserve, talks a lot about this, about how the government issues bonds for debts, and the Federal Reserve creates money out of the air, e-money, and then transfer that money into the Treasury and controls all these bonds that the U.S. taxpayer has to pay back. Also, the Federal Reserve is not a U.S. government entity. It tries to parade itself as that to the people who don't know better, but it is really a bunch of banks, and there's a lot of foreign interest, although that information is secret, that control those banks. And I also believe the Federal Reserve is guaranteed to get a 6% return, although I've heard discussions that say that may not be true. But anyway, it's a foreign controlled entity in most or in part, and it's enabling our government to just go crazy without any kind of restraint on spending. Why? Because the rich are too powerful to be taxed. They avoid it. The poor don't have anything, and there's only so much of a burden you can put on the middle class at once, so we just borrow from the future, and it will destroy our future if left unhindered. It might have already had destroyed our future with a $17 trillion debt. So get rid of the Federal Reserve. Number 7, equality under the law. America has essentially a 3-tiered justice system from how I see it. There's the justice system that if you're poor and don't have any means and don't have anyone to really represent you, you'll get low quality representation, be shuffled through the system, and you're lucky if you'll get a decent result. The middle tier is for the middle class people, and I think in America this is one of the good things about our country. I think the justice system still works pretty equitably for middle class versus middle class type transactions civilly. But then we have the super rich, famous, and their tier of the justice system, where, if you get drunk in your Ferrari and go out and kill somebody, you probably won't spend a day in jail, or you'll spend a couple months in jail. If you do Enron type activities and wipe out the savings and pensions of tens of thousands of people, you just get slapped in the wrist, and maybe people will look at you bad when you go into your Hampton clubhouse that summer. But if you pull a gun and rob a 7-Eleven and get $60, you'll probably go to prison for a bunch of years. I think that part of the way to determine sentencing is it has to be the amount of damage that's done by the crime should be part of the sentencing. And when elites do things, they typically do it more white collar, but the effects are often more devastating than, poor middle class people doing crimes. And it just needs to be fixed, and also accountability in government. And when politicians lie, when politicians break the law, just like if you were lying to your employer or you break the law, they should have to face up to that. And right now they're not. They just skate. They just get shuffled to a different position. There's so many scandals going on. It keeps the public distracted, so they can't counter them all. Why they focus on one scandal, 5 other scandals break. Shrinking the federal government and its responsibilities would do a lot to alleviate that. But having a more righteous judicial system, and it needs to be totally revamped. I think the core ideas of trial by jury, representation, and those things. It just needs a lot of the corruption. People having lawyer teams to select juries and the way jury selection works. All that needs to be reined in, because I think elites have played a lot of games there and screwed things up. Point number 8, simplify the tax code. And that's a no-brainer. It should be you make X amount of dollars. In my perfect world, I wouldn't quite go a fair tax where it's just like 20%. I would do a progressive tax. The reason being, if you're an elite or mega rich person in this country, if you get kidnapped in Panama, there's a good chance SEAL Team 6 will come looking for you. Where if Joe Smo like me gets kidnapped in Panama, I might get a letter sent to the Panamanian embassy saying, please look for Infocide, he's missing. So there is, I think, some differences in how you benefit from government services based on your position in society. So I think that having a progressive or a tiered tax system would be good, but I'd make it real simple. I'd say no taxes to X amount, 10% above this, 20% above that, 40% above that, and top it out at 50%. And, something along those lines. But have it be really simple where, you just take all your sources of revenue, add them together, figure out the tax brackets you paid through. You start at 0 up to 20. Okay, my first chunk of cash, I don't pay anything. This chunk to just this chunk, I pay 10%. This chunk to this chunk, I pay 20. This chunk to this chunk, I pay 40% on that. Add it all up, send it in. And again, as the federal government shrinks, hopefully the tax burden on the U.S. taxpayer needs to be reduced. And this leads to my other point. 9, rethink corporate personhood. I don't believe in corporate taxes. Corporations are non-people. They shouldn't pay any taxes. But at the same time, these CEOs who really didn't create the company just kind of went to business school and had some good connections, so they wind up running companies that are 200 years old and walk into this, job paying them millions. I have no problem with that if the people who own the company are that stupid to want to allow that. But the government's going to take their personal income and take a bigger chunk of that. Again, that progressive tax code. And this whole thing about corporate personhood, I'm not sure what the answer is, but the idea of corporations not being people legally but having no responsibilities as people, and it allows all sorts of chicanery to happen, like Donald Trump filed bankruptcy 4 times. I'm glad for bankruptcy, and I understand when you're an investor, especially one that's aggressive, sometimes you get burned and people take that risk when they give you their money to invest. But I'd say things are out of whack. I'm not sure what the answers are there, but I know that needs to be rethought. Number 10, we need to end the Great Society programs, but gradually. And again, this goes back to the federal government. We need to shrink it. Right now, the federal government is everyone's mommy. And it's kind of a tragedy because, again, the federal government can do some things well, but as my dad said, it usually doesn't do anything efficiently. So we have massive waste, massive abuse, massive bureaucracies, and it's a waste. So if we can somehow encourage people to give, it used to be in the old days before the Great Society programs, churches and local institutions and families would take care of their own. And I think unfortunately that ethic is, and again, point one, returning to the Judeo-Christian ethic worldview, all those institutions don't really do that anymore. If they do, not nearly as much as they did. So somehow encouraging that to replace government programs. And I think the federal government needs to get out of the welfare business. But until those non-governmental institutions that used to support people come back into life, we can't turn off the spigot. It's got to be done in a smart way, in a gradual way, but it needs to happen. And the expectation needs to be set that, you got to work hard. And right now, I sympathize with a lot of people because millions have lost their jobs due to outsourcing of the economy. Excuse me. And, more people going on the dole is just a factor of that. So hopefully as 0.7 or 0.5 tariffs get installed, 0.2 big businesses too big to fail and GSEs are busted up, so things become more competitive, then hopefully the economy will grow and there'll be more opportunities and we'll just naturally get people off the dole. But this generational stuff that happens, it's going to have to go away. And also another group that needs to get off the dole is big corporations. They're in a position to demand a lot of things from local governments and the federal government in order for, to broker deals about where they're going to produce things or locate the company headquarters, who's going to give them those tax breaks to go there. A lot of people complain that America has the highest corporate tax rate. It does, but the top Fortune 500 companies don't pay that rate. In fact, one example was, I think 2 years ago, General Electric got $5 billion back from the government while it was moving a lot of productions for things like light bulbs overseas and throwing a lot of Americans out of work. That shouldn't fly. All that stuff's got to stop. 11. This one's important. We need to really look how gerrymandering is done. Basically, that's the way voting districts are drawn up. I think that behind the scenes there's a lot of left-wing, statist, New World Order type organizations that are trying to gain control of Secretary of State positions and use lawfare to try to draw up voter districts in states that are just crazy. It's kind of this hidden secret, but if you look at voter districts in pretty much any state, they don't make any sense. And conservatives, from what I understand, I've seen this a couple times, or at least once anyway, are the largest ideological group in the United States. Polling, even though kind of that Judeo-Christian ethic is declining, conservatives still rule the day as far as being the biggest ideological group, yet they are the most powerless as far as getting their agenda done. Why is that? I think that relates directly back to gerrymandering, lawfare being used to sue, these minority groups will be underrepresented if you draw the line through, this block, so we got to draw it 10 blocks up. And it's just this political hidden mess that allows a lot of idiots to come into Congress. I hate to say it, but a lot of corrupt people that appeal to poverty-stricken areas, play on their emotions, play on their fears, come into office and then just loot like politicians in third world countries do. And that's got to be stopped. We really need to look at that, and all the hidden stuff that goes on there needs to be exposed and re-examined. Number 12, we've got to get rid of the hidden national security state. You know what? A lot of stuff has been made about the NSA spying on other countries. I have no problem with that. That's why we have intelligence agencies, even spying on, quote, allies, like Germany and France. Alternative media is going crazy about, oh my gosh, we're spying on Merkel's phone. You know what? Any politician or world leader has to know that if they make a call over an unencrypted communication device, that it's going to be intercepted by both friend and foe. And Germany and Japan are some of the, and China especially, France, all the people who complain are some of the worst industrial espionage perpetrators against the United States and the world. So I find it hilarious that they're so concerned. Also, behind the scenes, a lot of them are part of the NSA spy ring. America had all these resources in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and built this massive global surveillance grid. And other countries, rather than build their own, or in addition to building their own, signed on to this NSA grid. I mean, look up Project Echelon and other things, and you'll find evidence. Although they even admit it, the French and the Germans admit it, and the Chinese just bitch about it for political gain. They're the worst at stealing stuff. But the thing is it's an important concept that Americans need to relearn, and that is what a public servant is. What a public servant is you, the people, are the master, and the public servant, those who work in government, including national security, are the servants. They're the employees, and you can fire them when they don't do what you want. Now, a lot of the national security types, some of them are on Twitter. I talked or tweeted back and forth with a couple professors at the Naval Postgraduate School, and it was kind of disheartening, their attitude. And I understand that their job isn't to be the PR for the NSA, although there's this huge feud that's exactly what they're doing, and they're breaking like the Hatch Act. But I won't get into that. I don't really care that much. I think they have a right academically to have points of view and advocate them. But it was really disheartening because basically their attitude is, you got nothing to worry about, just trust us. And if you critique the national security state doing domestic spying, you're a bozo. You may not even be that patriotic. Now, as a person who worries about a techno-dystopia forming, and, you know, that's the kind of attitude that I would expect for them to say, oh, just don't worry about it, trust us. I'd like to remind everybody that this country was not founded on the trust of government. We rebelled. We were part of the English Empire, and a lot of people still say we are financially, but that's for another time. And we rebelled against that. And when the founding fathers set up the new government of this republic, it was all about checks and balances, limited government, individual liberty, not trusting people. And part of the problem with the United States is we really have become a nation of sheeple. We've forgotten checks and balances. You know, you have actors like Sean Penn and other idiots coming out talking about how, you know, certain politicians that express views that are different than theirs should be, you know, by executive order assigned to, or was it Ted Cruz, assigned to, you know, a mental ward, or abolishing the Tea Party. There's a petition on Twitter for that from the statist left. And, you know, it's like you go against the state and everyone thinks you're a bad person. You know, teabaggers. You know, what does the Tea Party stand for? It stands for limited government, fiscal responsibility, and individual liberty. And, you know, that's suddenly bad. You're a teabagger if you do that. If someone calls me a teabagger, I'll just say it's better to be a teabagger than a teabaggee, and the state's teabagging you, not me. You know, I'm kind of digressing here. But the idea of the answer of our public servants saying, oh, just trust us, you have nothing to worry about. If you do a Twitter search on InfoCyde, INFOCYDE, space, hashtag surveillance society, all one word, I track the surveillance state, and it's growing exponentially every day. I see articles on it now. And there's some stuff that's really disturbing there. And our public officials that are our servants, our employees, when we ask them what they're doing, they tell us that not to worry about it, and if we are worried about it, that we're stupid and we're not patriotic. Those guys need to be fired. I don't care how academic they are, or what kind of military rank they have, or what kind of medals they have. Their job as public servants is to say, okay, this is my task that you gave me to defend the nation. Here is the best way I see how to do that. And they can come back to me, their boss, the public, and try to sell me on it. But I, as the public, think in larger terms of not just national security, but I also think about personal liberty, what it means to be an American, freedom, stuff like that. I'm not focused exclusively on my little niche of national security. So I might come back to my public servants and say, those are good ideas, but I feel they're a little bit too intrusive. Thank you. We don't want you to do that, and you won't. And then the national security public servants have the choice to accept that, do the will of the people, or get fired. They don't have the choice in a republic where the public servants are responsible to the citizenry to go, don't worry about it, you're too stupid to understand this, and go away. No, that doesn't fly, and that's exactly what I'm hearing from the national security types. And that means to me that I have zero sympathy for them. Let's fire them. And you know what? There's all sorts of hidden stuff there. The whole national security umbrella, and mind you, I'm not naive about this. I know you can't have everything out in public. You need to have some secrets so the enemy doesn't get them. And we do have lots of enemies. But the idea, there's just, that umbrella is used to cover up a whole bunch of stuff. I think DHS is actually, I'm not convinced that they're not, as our government is controlled by big banks and corporations, which are in turn controlled by a secretive cabal, in my opinion. I just don't understand exactly what and the government controls the national security apparatus. So for me to just default trust them, I don't, nor should I. Again, as an American citizen, this country was founded on mistrust, not trust, on checks and balances. So if the national security state isn't going to sell me on why my Facebook needs to be passively monitored, why every communication since roughly 2011 is captured for later review, they've got to tell me and convince me that even though I might have political activities that I do now that are covered under free speech, the government one day won't go tyrannical and then back search through algorithmic searches and all this data they collected. So right now I'm free to talk about certain things, God, Jesus, criticize the country when it does bad things. But none of that stuff may be legal in the future, and they've got records of everything. So we're just trusting them with our lives, and they search our emails, they track our license plates, they're putting facial recognition now, tying all the cameras together. There's lamp posts that can intercept your voice, connect it. Whenever you use Siri or the Android equivalent, you're basically helping the National Security Agency to develop better voice recognition software. And, and the no-fly list has the potential to become the no-jobs list, the persona non grata list, the no-vote list, and there's no legal recourse for all this stuff. So basically the government is telling us how they are going to help us, how they are going to serve us, and they're not giving us a choice. That, to me, sounds like the servants throwing a rebellion against the master, the public. And it shouldn't be tolerated, and it should be rolled back in a massive way. And that will also lead to government shrinking. I remember hearing about generals in Afghanistan talking about how this great intelligence apparatus that we have gave them almost zero actionable intelligence, and they had to rely on their own organic sources to get any kind of actionable intelligence to go after the enemy. And, behind the scenes, I'm 100% convinced that the intelligence agency is involved in the drug trade, provides nice revenue streams for black budget operations, money laundering. The banks have their fingers in it as well. And I'm also convinced that the intelligence agencies are into MK Ultra and all that. It came out in the 50s, 60s, and I think up to the 70s where they were busted doing it. And I think they're still doing it. I think they're doing it in major ways. There's all sorts of shade and evil that is covered under this national security umbrella, and it needs to be rolled back. Now, I'm not saying we don't need spy agencies. I'm not saying that under circumstances that are approved by us, the public, with a legal framework, that American non-citizens or non-citizens living in this country and citizens here might not fall under domestic surveillance. I'm cool with that. But the idea of everything being monitored, everything, every activity I do, and trusting the government with it all when it's already corrupt and controlled by corporations, I'm not going for that. And I don't think you should either. Number 13, end the left-right spectrum is the most important access for political comparison. Right now, we're all divided in these ideological camps that basically along the axis of this. You have conservatives to the right, you have progressive liberals to the left, you have libertarians kind of on the same axis but different. I think what the real axis that needs to be judged on is whether you're a moral person or not. I don't care if you're a communist. I don't care if you're a socialist. I don't even care if you're a fascist. If you stand by your convictions, you don't lie, you always tell the truth, you don't have a hidden agenda, all your agenda items are up on the table, you're coming at things very openly, what exactly you want to accomplish, and you're following through on that and nothing else. I would rather have those people in the political arena than people who say they're conservative but really are getting bought off and serve some kind of hidden trans-capital agenda and or some esoteric weird thing where they want to create a new world order and use people's fear of climate control or climate change to regulate every economic activity and form some kind of fascist global state based on that. And I could get all over into that. But, even if that's what you want to do, have all your cards on the table and don't lie. We need to have people who are honest about what they're about be in government. And people that are honest and conduct themselves in a moral way, regardless of what their political opinions are, as long as they're upfront with them, should be given respect and civility. But people, regardless of their political persuasion, if they're a bunch of liars and crooks, even if they're ideologically close to you, it shouldn't be accepted. Liberals really make me angry because Obama gets up there and lies almost every day, and they know it, but they won't admit it because he's their boy, he's advancing their political footballs. And there's plenty of conservatives supposed conservatives that do the same in Congress. It can't be tolerated. Don't keep allowing corrupt people to rule, no matter what their ideology is. Let's get honest, upstanding people in there. And I know that's a tall order, but it's crucial to the American enterprise success. 14, and this goes back to what my rant on national security, but put people back in charge. Let's have government remember that they serve us. They're not our mommy. They're not our daddy. They're our servants. And what we say goes. If they don't like it, they need to find another job. They don't get to the privilege of looking at us as little sheep or little baby kids that they need to protect and mother, and they're so intellectually superior and so expert in their fields that they can talk down to us and gain control for our benefit. All that needs to go out of the way. We're a republic. We're citizens. We're not subjects. And that whole ethic needs to be restored both to the people in government and empowering our citizenry to think that. Quit thinking of yourself as a victim. Quit thinking of yourself as somebody who deserves the world. You know, I'm against all the inequity and a lot of the evil that happens, but, you know, do your best to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you're doing that, and it's obvious you're doing that, I think the American people are generous and would be happy to help you if it's not working out, but you're doing what you can. If you're just lazy, then you're not going to get much sympathy. So we need to return that ethic back that you're in charge of your life. You're a sovereign, and sometimes that's scary because it comes with a little bit more responsibility than being a sheep or a subject. But that's the way our country was designed. It doesn't work when we become sheep and subjects. And that's what the government, in my opinion, the federal government, is trying to do. Maybe not consciously, but with the types of personalities that fall into government, it seems to be the net result we get. And for the last point tonight, and this is targeted to a very specific group of people, of which I myself fall into. Christians need to depoliticize. And I say this after I just went on a giant politicized rant and returned to Jesus. You know, Christians are citizens of the United States, but really we're also citizens of heaven, and we need to put more priority on that than our citizenship in the United States. One of the problems with America and why it's turning away from the Judeo-Christian work ethic or moral ethic, is because the Christians in this country have failed. The true Christians, the real bride of Christ. We have been distracted by all sorts of things. We've been lulled into complacency. We've grown decadent because life here has been so good, and we're not turning away from the worldly stuff and focusing on Jesus enough to where we have true power in our lives to transform the people around us. You know, everyone's always watching us Christians, and you know, BS, pardon my French, BS walks. Reality is something that, I shouldn't even say that. This shows a level of worldliness in myself, too, just by using that phraseology. But what the world's looking for is true power. What they want to see in you is that God is real and that God is having an impact on your life. I think that non-Christians in this country are desperately looking, some of them are, some of them aren't, but a lot of them are, for true power to transform their lives, to get them reconnected with God. They know subconsciously or consciously that something's missing, that the material world and the world that's fabricated for us through the media is not what's real. And they're searching. And Christians, if you have Christ in you, you should be radiating Jesus Christ out to a lost world by power, by yourself actually being transformed to be more like Jesus rather than more like you. And that lost world will see that. They'll see that power. They'll see the reality of God in you, not in an abstract concept, but actually working, living in you as you interact with an unsaved world. And we as Christians some of us aren't, you know, and I shouldn't say all Christians are bad at this. I know I am. I'm all compromised with sin and distracted and horrible, to the point where sometimes I even wonder if I'm really saved or not. And I think a lot of the church is like that. We need to really point back to Jesus so that Jesus can transform us. We need to do that through prayer. You know, faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the Word of God. We need to be reading our Bibles. We need to be holding each other up, loving each other. And instead, we're all distracted and all over the place. We're getting hung up on minor details of doctrine, and we're not fulfilling the great commitment. We're not doing Romans 12, you know, offer yourself a living sacrifice so you may prove what is, I can't quote the verse exactly right now, but, you know, holy, right, and just. We need to do that if we're going to have any effect on the society. We can't legislate back the Judeo-Christian ethic. Once it's gone, it's gone. It won't come back unless individually we are transforming the people around us and in a micro level, and so many Christians are doing that in a macro level. It transforms society. So I encourage any Christians out there to really focus on Jesus, and if it means depoliticizing a little bit, then do it. I'm out of time. Thank you for listening. Good night.